When I think about cultural responsiveness, and I think in industry we call it just diversity and inclusion, there's three basic components. Can you describe those for me?
Absolutely, absolutely. So cultural responsiveness is a unique people-centered approach in which an individual's unique cultural strengths are identified, acknowledged, and nurtured, so that you're highlighting their ability to lead from their leadership orientation, or in the case of education, someone's ability to really teach. And so there are three functional dimensions that we often talk about that is advisable to use. The first is the institutional dimension. And the institutional dimension is one where you look at highlighting what are the policies, practices, and structures in place in a particular institution that can perpetuate sort of oppressive practices.
So give me an example of that. So we're looking at, let's just say, rules. Do you have an example of a rule that would fall in that institutional dimension?
Absolutely. So one rule that comes to mind is how does an HR team, a human resources team, sort of navigate complaints about employees based on either race, gender, or ethnicity? Are they instituting the same policies equally across the board?
Yeah, well, why would I want to institute them differently?
Because if you start to institute them differently, it means that you're now demonstrating that you have an appetite for bringing about change, because you're becoming more culturally responsive or more culturally competent. And if you do not, it says that you are someplace on the culturally competent spectrum that is not healthy for your organization, given the context in which we live.
Yeah, so when you think about the context in which we live, and I'll just use plain language,
Sure.
a person who's in a dominant group,
Yes.
and if we're using race, we would say white, is less likely to get complaints
Sure.
just by nature of their race. And so if we're in HR, if we're trying to make sure that we're being more equitable on the institution dimension, then I would consider that.
Absolutely, you would.
Okay.
Which brings me to the second functional dimension,
Okay.
which is the leadership dimension. And the leadership dimension really speaks to how are you exhibiting your practices? What is your leadership stand? How do people observe you every single day in the work that you do? And the leadership dimension is one where you have to be intentional about making sure that regardless of the position you hold, when you're making decisions, you're grounding them in equity or equitable practices.
And so when I am looking at the leadership dimension, I am being thoughtful about who I'm including, who I promote, who I hire, who I fire, disciplinary practices that the individual leader has control over.
Absolutely. One great example that comes up for me is around hiring practices.
Okay.
Right? As a leader in a human resources department, when you are being told that, or you and your organization have decided that you want to have equitable sort of or diversity across your team, who are you hiring? Is there some intentionality around making sure that there's a level of effort where you're seeking not just dominant class, not just a single gender, but you creating opportunities for everyone?
And one way that we know that we have to work on the leadership dimension is if I look up one day and my entire team is kind of maybe from the same university, for example, or we've overcorrected that way.
You have, and you have to be careful not to just check the box by hiring on a team of 10, 5 males and 5 females, right? 5 whites and 5 blacks. Checking the box doesn't mean that you're becoming more culturally competent. It means that you're just checking the box and you're still perpetuating the practices. Which brings us to the third dimension, which is often called the growth or the stretch dimension, and that is the personal dimension.
Okay.
And that's the one where you have to become more reflective and introspective to examine your own blind spots, your own biases. And it's the hardest of the 3 dimensions, and it's the one that you probably should start with first.
Yeah, when I think about just common terms, the personal dimension is prejudice. My bias is conscious or otherwise, and oftentimes people want to skip past their own individual biases and jump to the leadership dimension, or take a look at the policies and practices instead of doing their own internal work to see how they might be keeping those systems in place.
I appreciate the way that you've just sort of made an alignment to the personal dimension and prejudice. So in the same vein, when you think of the other 2 dimensions, institutional and leadership, what alignment of words would you have there that are common for us to understand?
Yeah, so the leadership dimension is where discrimination shows up. So you now have some kind of power over me, and now you have the ability to discriminate. When you are, the personal dimension is just those quick decisions you're making inside your head. But now, who gets to be a part of our succession plan or not?
Sure.
Who gets to have leadership opportunities or not? Who do we think is CEO material or not? That's where the discrimination dimension comes in. And then if we were looking at the institutional dimension, I would think that most people would call that oppression.
And it's based on the practices that we're seeing every day that are being perpetuated. That does not either change the game in an equitable way, but it just perpetuates the status quo.
Yeah, and one of the only thing that I would just kind of add to this discussion is often when people are talking about cultural responsiveness or diversity and inclusion, they like to lump all kinds of difference in the same bucket as race and equity. And while prejudice kind of follows the prejudice discrimination institutional, when I'm thinking about all other kinds of difference, they kind of progress in that way.
Yes,
the individual, the two people, then the group or the system. But race, because it's a completely made up social construct, actually started in the reverse.
Sure.
And so sometimes, if not always, we need to start with equitable laws and practices and rules at the institutional level if we want to ever see equity from a race perspective.
Absolutely, I appreciate how you sum that up.
Yeah.
Essentially, so cultural responsiveness is this unique approach that is intended not necessarily just to dismantle systems of oppression, but it's really a strong tool that teams and organizations can use to create equitable opportunities and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Well, thank you so much.